Drop it.
A year to support countries such as the Philippines to do that energy transition and to adapt to climate change. Specifically on the energy transition point, so we will definitely be part of the solution. We have committed 11.6 million pounds of climate finance over 5 years, billion pounds, so that's quite a lot of money, not million. And some of that will be going to the Philippines, working through multilateral development banks such as the Asian Development Bank, working with private sectors, because of course we can be part of the solution, but it's all the resources coming from the finance, from the private sector that will really make the difference, and the private sector can partner with the private sector to really try to make that transition quickly.
So I believe this is your first time here in Iloilo. So how do you find Iloilo City and the Ilonggo people in general?
So not only is it my first time in Iloilo, but it's also my first time outside of Manila for work. So it was really important for me to come to Iloilo. I've heard so much about Iloilo before I even moved to the Philippines. So I'm really happy to be here. And I've loved it thus far. It's been a day and a half. I've been really lucky. I've met a lot of people and tasted lots of lovely food, so that was really exciting as well. So everyone's been really welcoming, everyone's been really generous and kind. So I don't think it could have gone any better. Thank you.
I talk about climate change. One of the problems that confront the world in adapting to an environment-friendly country is our failure to communicate with ordinary people to join the crusade against climate change. So, Ambassador, in simple terms, can you give us a little summary of what climate change is all about and what shall we do in our individual capacity to preserve our environment?
Great, that's an excellent question. So, climate change is about two things. It's about emissions that mean that the world is getting hotter. So addressing climate change has got to be about reducing those emissions, moving from a carbon heavy energy to low carbon renewable energy. That's been a really, really strong emphasis for us as the UK over the last year, working with big emitters to make that happen. And then the second emphasis is on adaptation. So sadly, as we know, climate change is already happening and it will continue to happen, and there will be unavoidable consequences. So the second part of climate change is really about how do you adapt to those consequences? How do you shape your economy differently? How do you build housing that is resilient to storms? How do you plan better for extreme weather events? How do you adapt your practice in fisheries or protect your land through mangroves? So those are all really, that's what it's all about. In terms of what we can all do, I think there's a lot in terms of protecting nature and looking after our nature, all of us. Nature is at the heart of climate change. So, this morning I was planting mangrove trees. It's a symbol, but it's so important because actually all those trees, they absorb CO2. So they absorb some of the carbon that is responsible for climate change. And they also protect us from extreme weather events, as we know, and as we saw 8 years ago in Typhoon Haiyan. So there's definitely part of it in protecting nature. And then in our choices, in our day-to-day choices, we affect climate change. So even what we eat, if we eat locally and seasonally, then we're not importing lots of food from all over the world, and so we're reducing the emissions that come from transport. So simple things like that. Other things around our choices, everyday choices as consumers. If we buy, there's aircon in this room, for example. Energy efficient aircon room will consume a lot less energy than some other forms of aircon. So we can all check when we buy products that we are choosing energy efficient versions. And of course we can choose to go for renewable energy, use solar panels where we can. We can choose to travel less, to minimize our individual carbon footprint. There's so many things we can do as individuals. We all have a responsibility. That's why I think your question is excellent.
Yes, and of course for a less developed country like the Philippines, and the resources are very limited. What advice can you give to our local leaders to at least lessen the impact of this global phenomenon?
So I think your local leaders are really gripping this, and they're really aware of the impacts of climate change on the Philippines. So there's something about disasters in the Philippines, sadly. And the Philippines is investing a lot more in disaster preparedness, so really having this the infrastructure in place to know when disasters are likely to strike, to prepare in advance. So that's one thing. But then it's really about planning for the future, so projecting what we think the impacts of climate change are going to be, and then planning accordingly. So again, in the case of Iloilo, where flooding is such a concern, planning for flooding. So that means flood defenses, it means more green spaces to absorb water from the floods, it means building everything, all the infrastructure in areas that are less prone to floods. It means supporting populations to relocate if need be, or at least encouraging them to live in areas that are not prone to flood so that they are safer. So there's lots of planning that needs to be involved, and developing infrastructure, even housing, that can resist to floods. And I'm just using the examples of floods, but there are many more, for example, with respect to fisheries. And again, I want to come back to mangroves, because that is so important in protecting livelihoods of so many people.
Okay, let's talk about COVID-19 vaccines.
Sure.
In a very cynical situation for every country in the world, COVID-19, our Philippine leaders, especially here in Iloilo City, prefer the procurement of vaccines from your country, AstraZeneca. So compared to other vaccine manufacturing countries, and I believe this reflects the kind of trust and confidence that we Filipinos hold closely to our hearts. And your representation, do you think the British Embassy can help hasten the delivery of COVID-19 vaccines in the Philippines, like here in Iloilo City and Iloilo Province?
Yes. So thank you. Vaccines are absolutely essential. They are our best line of defense alongside these masks to protect us. So it is right that we continue to talk about that. We as the UK have worked really hard to support the Philippines in its access to vaccines. We've given 415,000 vaccines directly, but we've also given a lot through COVAX, which is the global facility for vaccines, which has redistributed some of our contributions. And we have supported LGUs in their negotiations with AstraZeneca to get direct access to vaccines. We will continue this work. We are continuing this work in particular, and so you can expect more from us on that. I should say, though, that the challenge now in the Philippines is not just the number of vaccines that comes into the country, but the more logistical challenges of ensuring they get down to the point of delivery and they are distributed in a timely fashion to all citizens, and in particular those that live in rather remote areas.
Let's talk about education, because majority of the Filipino youths now are adventurous and ambitious on a positive note. So what are the scholarship opportunities in UK for deserving Filipinos?
We've got a great scholarship program which is called the Chevening Scholarship, that supports young people to go and do a fully paid master's degree of their choice in the university of their choice in the UK. So that's been a really successful program, and we've been really lucky because we've had hugely talented Filipino students from all over the country apply and successfully go to the UK. And I was just this week was meeting a cohort of Chevening scholars, and it's incredibly energizing because they are such a wonderful human bridge between the UK and the Philippines, passionate about both countries, but very passionate about using what they have learned in the UK to support long-term inclusive development in this country. So I encourage all of your listeners to keep it in mind and to consider applying. It's a fantastic program. It's called Chevening, and there's so much more on our website and in our social media pages.
British accent is becoming very popular now among Filipinos. Is there any chance that we can possibly enhance the likeness of the Filipinos about your British English by the way of exchange students, exchange professors, like that?
So we already have quite a lot of exchanges in tertiary education, in particular with transnational educations, whereby British universities offer courses here in Filipino universities, And the advantage of that is that Filipino students don't necessarily have to leave the country to get either a British degree or a British course. And there's more and more of that happening, not least with all the changes in technology and in education technology in particular, which facilitate these sort of learning exchanges in English, but very many other subjects as well.
Finally, your message to all the Filipinos watching worldwide and to the Ilonggos.
Maraming salamat para sa welcome inyo. I am absolutely delighted to be in the Philippines. It is proving to be an absolutely awesome country, not just because it is beautiful, we knew that before, but because of its people. It's their kindness, their generosity, their sense of humor, and their welcome has been second to none. I'm here in the Philippines with my husband and my 2 young children, and we already feel at home after less than 3 months. So we can't wait to explore the rest of the country and get to know as many people as possible across the country. Maraming salamat. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for making the time. I'm very grateful, and thank you for organizing.
Ari kami ni Mia sa... No, not in Korea, in Switzerland. Ari kami subong sa...
And it's so cold.
UK.
Ang lamig.
UK.
Grabe.
Grabe.
Tumibidyo.
Kabudlay, wala kay... Ang amon, subong nga income sa vlog. Ginalagaw-lagaw lang namon. Ay, lamig. Paano na, Dayman? So many places to go, so little time. Char.
Hindi siya. Kasi hindi guys lamig. Oh my God, it's so cold.
Ay, kalamig. Dugay-dugay pala winter na. So, nag-prepare. Sa Switzerland, may tricycle ka, adapt man sila sa living the way Filipinos used to live their lives. Ano daw? May jeep man di, guys. May jeep. May jeep man.
Kita man na natin. Kita man.
Bye.